I woke before my alarm that morning, the way you do when a day has been circling in your mind for weeks. Or, my retirement party. 41 years at the plant, and my daughter Melissa had promised she'd handle everything: the hall, the guest list, the cake. All I had to do was show up and let people say nice things about me for a change. I made coffee and stood at the kitchen window watching the sun come up over the maples, and I thought about how strange it is to close a chapter that long. 41 years of waking up at 5:30, of steel and grease under my fingernails, of watching young men come through my department as boys and leave as fathers themselves. I'd given that plant more hours than I'd given my own family, if I was honest with myself, and my late wife Carol used to tease me about it, gently, the way she teased me about everything. She'd been gone 6 years now. I still made 2 cups of coffee some mornings out of habit before I remembered. My grandson Tommy was the reason I'd said yes to a big party at all. He was 7, sharp as a tack, and he'd been asking me for a month what a retirement party even was. "Is it like a birthday, Grandpa, but for a job?" I told him it was better than a birthday, because it meant I'd finally have time to teach him how to fish properly, the way my own father had taught me on the lake up in Michigan. He'd hugged my leg and told me I was the best grandpa in the whole world, and I'd carried that feeling around in my chest for weeks like a lit candle. Things with my son-in-law, Brett, had been different lately, cooler. He'd married Melissa 9 years ago, and for most of that time he'd been decent enough to me, not warm, never warm, but decent. Lately, though, the visits had gotten shorter. The excuses came faster. Melissa would call and I'd hear something tight in her voice, something she wasn't saying, and when I asked her about it she'd laugh it off and change the subject. I told myself it was just the stress of 2 working parents and a growing boy. I told myself a lot of things that year, mostly because the alternative was too painful to sit with. The hall Melissa had rented was out past the highway, a banquet space attached to a golf course, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a little stage for speeches. When I pulled into the lot that afternoon, I nearly turned back around, because there were more cars there than I'd ever expected for a retirement party. Melissa had told me 40, 50 people. Looking at that lot, I'd have guessed closer to 120. I found out later she'd invited half the old plant, all of Brett's business associates, half the neighborhood, and every relative on both sides, going back 2 generations. She wanted it to be a spectacle, she told me once the crowd had gathered, because I deserved a spectacle. My daughter has always had a big heart and an even bigger sense of occasion, and standing there in the parking lot with my good blazer on, feeling the nerves flutter in my stomach, I let myself believe that all of it, the crowd, the banners, the noise, was simply love, dressed up loud. Inside, the hall was strung with banners that read 41 years of service in gold letters. And there was a slideshow of old photographs playing on a screen at the front: me as a young man in my work uniform, me holding Melissa as a baby, me and Carol at some long ago Christmas. Someone had clearly put real care into it. I felt my throat tighten looking at those pictures of a life I barely recognized as my own anymore. It felt so far away and so close, all at once. I scanned the crowd for Tommy, the way I always did first, before anything else registered. I found him near the dessert table in his little blue sweater vest, standing on his toes to see the cake, and something in my chest loosened just looking at him. He hadn't seen me yet. I started making my way toward him, weaving between clusters of old coworkers, shaking my hand. Women from the church patting my arm, saying things like 41 years. Can you believe it? And Carol would be so proud. I nodded and smiled and kept moving toward my grandson, because in that moment nothing else in the room mattered. Tommy turned, and his whole face lit up. "Grandpa," he shouted, the way only a 7-year-old can shout a word, pure joy with no filter on it at all, and he came running across that hall, dodging legs and folding chairs with his arms already stretched wide. I dropped to one knee right there on the polished floor, arms open, ready to catch him the way I'd caught him 1,000 times before. I never saw Brett coming. He came from my left, fast, and I only registered the blur of his suit jacket a half-second before his shoulder caught me square in the chest. The force of it sent me backward into a table of centerpieces, and I went down hard, my hip catching the corner of a chair on the way, my head snapping back against the edge of the table behind me. The room exploded into sound gasps. Someone screaming, glass shattering somewhere close. I lay there for a moment with the wind knocked clean out of me, staring up at the banquet hall's ceiling tiles, genuinely unsure for a second whether I'd tripped, whether this was some kind of accident. Then I heard Brett's voice above me, and there was nothing accidental in it at all. "Stay away from my son," he snarled, standing over me with his fists still clenched, his face red and twisted in a way I had never once seen in 9 years of knowing him. "You don't get to touch him, not after what you did." I had no idea, lying on that floor with my ears ringing, what he thought I had done. I heard Tommy crying somewhere behind him, a small, terrified sound that cut through me worse than the fall had. I heard Melissa's voice, high and panicked, calling my name. "Tommy X." I pushed myself up onto one elbow, my hip screaming with pain, my hand finding the back of my head where a knot was already rising, and I looked up at my son-in-law standing over me in front of what had to be 120 guests, all of them frozen, all of them staring, the slideshow still cycling behind him through pictures of my whole life like some cruel joke. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I want to tell you that 41 years of biting my tongue in that plant, of being the steady one, the reasonable one, held firm in that moment. It didn't. Something in me that I didn't know still existed came awake on that floor. I got to my feet slower than I would have liked, my hips screaming, my head pounding, and I did not think. I did not plan. I simply moved. My hand came up and struck him across the face with everything I had left in my 63-year-old body. The sound of it cracked through that silent hall like a rifle shot. Brett stumbled sideways, his hand flying to his cheek, his eyes wide with a shock that mirrored, I imagine, my own. "How dare you?" I heard myself say, and my voice didn't even sound like mine. It was low and shaking and full of something I hadn't touched in decades. "How dare you put your hands on me, in front of my grandson, in front of everyone who came here to honor me? What is wrong with you? And why?" The whole hall had gone silent except for Tommy's crying and the hum of the slideshow projector. Melissa was pushing through the crowd toward us, her face white as chalk, and behind her I could see my sister, my old foreman, neighbors I'd known for 20 years. But all of them staring at me and at Brett like they'd wandered into a play they hadn't bought tickets for. "He hit me," Brett said, backing up, his hand still on his reddening cheek. Playing to the room now, I could see it. The same way a man plays a hand of cards he knows is weak. Everyone saw that. "He assaulted me. After you tackled a 63-year-old man in front of 100 people," I said, and I was surprised at how steady my voice had gotten, how the shaking had turned into something colder. "Why don't you tell them why?" "I tell them why." "Why?" He didn't answer. He just glared at me, breathing hard, and I realized in that moment that whatever this was, whatever grievance had been building in him, he hadn't expected me to still be standing. He hadn't expected me to still have fight in me. People had made that mistake about me my whole life. Quiet men get underestimated. That's just the way of the world, and for 41 years I'd let them. Because there'd never been a reason not to. There was a reason now. I didn't call the police, not yet. I didn't reach for my phone to record anything, though half a dozen guests already had theirs out. Instead, I looked past Brett, past my daughter's stricken face, and I found the one person in that hall I knew wouldn't flinch from what was coming. My old friend Walter had been sitting near the back with his wife, a man I'd worked beside for 30 years and who'd become something closer to a brother than a coworker, a man who also happened to have spent the last decade of his career as an attorney after he left the floor to go back to school at 50. I caught his eye. I didn't say a word. I just nodded toward the small office off the side of the banquet hall, and Walter, God bless him, understood immediately and got up. While we waited for him, Melissa reached me, gripping my arm, her eyes wet, asking me over and over if I was all right. Was I hurt? Did I need a doctor? And underneath all of it I could hear the question she wasn't asking yet: what had Brett meant? "What did you do?" I held her hand and told her I was fine, and I meant it more than she knew, because whatever had cracked open in me on that floor had also, strangely, settled something. I had spent 6 years since Carol died being careful, being quiet, letting my daughter's marriage be her business and my grandson's upbringing be somebody else's decision. Something about hitting that cold floor had reminded me that I still had a voice and a spine, and things I had every right to say. Walter came back out a few minutes later with a folder in his hand, the kind of folder a man only carries when he already knows what's in it, because I'd given him a copy of certain documents 2 years earlier, back when I first started noticing the strange chill that had crept into Brett's voice whenever money came up. Walter stood beside me now, calm as still water, and I turned to face the crowd, my hip aching, the knot on my head throbbing, and for the first time in my life I understood what it meant to have people's full and undivided attention. "Since apparently we're doing this here," I said, and my voice carried across that hall better than I expected. 41 years of shouting over factory floor noise apparently good for something after all. Let's do it here. I looked at Brett. 2 years ago, you asked me to co-sign the loan on your restaurant. I did it because Melissa asked me to, and because I loved you like a son, God help me. I put my name and my retirement savings on the line for that business. And for 2 years, the payments have been late, then missed, then covered quietly by me without you ever knowing because I didn't want to embarrass you in front of my daughter. I didn't want Tommy to grow up watching his parents fight about money. The color was draining out of Brett's face now, fast, and I could see Melissa's grip on my arm tighten, her breath catching. What I want to know, I continued, is why a man I bailed out of bankruptcy 3 separate times this year decided that today, of all days, in front of everyone who has ever mattered to me, was the day to put his hands on me. Walter opened the folder and held it up, not for me, but for the room, the way a man presents evidence because he understands that some truths only matter once they're witnessed. I have copies of the loan documents, the missed payment notices, and the wire transfers, he said, his voice even and unhurried. All of it bears Frank's signature, and Frank's money. None of it bears Brett's, not for the last 14 months. That's not, Brett started, but his voice cracked on the second word, and whatever he'd been about to say died somewhere in his throat. There's more, I said, and I hated that there was. I hated that I'd been sitting on this for 3 weeks trying to decide whether it was even my business to know, let alone say out loud. Walter, show them the rest. Walter hesitated, just for a second, giving me one last chance to stop, and when I didn't, he pulled a second set of papers from the folder. 2 weeks ago, Frank discovered that his son-in-law had taken out a second loan against the restaurant's equipment that Frank's collateral secured without informing him. That loan was used to pay off a personal debt unrelated to the business. A debt, Walter said, glancing at me once more, related to a woman named Danielle who is not Frank's daughter. The gasp that went through that hall was audible, a single collective intake of breath, and I watched my daughter's hand fly to her mouth, watched the folder of composure she'd been holding onto since Brett hit the floor crumble entirely. She looked at her husband the way you look at a stranger who's been wearing your husband's face. Melissa, I can explain, Brett said, turning to her, reaching for her, and she stepped back from him like his hand was fire. You tackled my father, she said, and her voice had gone very quiet, very flat. The way voices go when the shouting is finished and something colder has taken its place. In front of my son, in front of everyone we know, because he found out you'd been stealing from him to pay off some woman. It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like, Brett. She was crying now, but her spine had gone rigid, and I recognized that posture, because it was Carol's posture. What? The one she used to take when she'd finally had enough. Because right now it looks exactly like what it is. I didn't say anything else. I didn't need to. I'd spent my whole life believing that the right thing to do was to stay quiet, to smooth things over, to protect people from hard truths, even when the truth was the only thing that could actually save them. 41 years on a factory floor teaches you patience. But it doesn't teach you when patience becomes its own kind of lie. Someone had called security by then, or maybe it was the golf course manager, worried about his banquet hall. But either way, 2 men in polo shirts appeared at the edge of the crowd asking if everything was all right, if they needed to call the police. I looked at Brett, who was standing alone now in the middle of that hall, his cheek still red from my hand, Melissa 6 feet away from him with Tommy clutched against her side. And something in me, some old and tired part, didn't want to see it go any further than it already had. No police, I said. Not tonight. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, and I'll be damned if I let it turn into something the newspapers write about. I walked over to where Melissa stood, and I knelt down in front of Tommy, my hips still aching with every movement, and I looked into his tear-streaked face, so much like his mother's had been at that age, and I told him the only thing that mattered in that moment, which was that none of this was his fault, that grown-ups sometimes make terrible decisions and terrible mistakes, but that he was loved by every single person who mattered, and that would never, ever change. He wrapped his small arms around my neck and held on, and I held him back, and for a moment the rest of that ruined hall simply disappeared, The party ended early, obviously. People filed out in twos and threes, murmuring, some of them stopping to squeeze my shoulder or shake my hand on their way past. A few of them looking at Brett with open disgust as he stood alone by the dessert table nobody wanted anymore. My old foreman came up and told me, quietly, that he'd worked beside a lot of men over the years and not many of them would have handled a betrayal like that with as much restraint as I just had. All things considered, I didn't feel restrained. I felt like a house that had been standing for 63 years and had just discovered, in a single afternoon, exactly how much weight its foundation could actually hold. Melissa didn't go home with Brett that night. She came to my place instead, Tommy asleep in the back seat of her car by the time they pulled into my driveway, and we sat at my kitchen table, the same table Carol and I had eaten 1,000 breakfasts at, and she cried in a way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl. I made tea I don't even think either of us drank, and I let her talk, and when she was done talking I told her the truth. I'd been sitting on for weeks, that I had known something was wrong for a long time, that I had covered those missed payments quietly because I loved her and didn't want her to carry the weight of it, and that I regretted deeply not telling her sooner, because maybe if I had, she wouldn't have found out the way she did, in front of 100 strangers, with her father bleeding on a banquet hall floor. "You shouldn't have had to protect me from this," she said, wiping her eyes. "I'm not 7 years old anymore, Dad." "No," I said, "you're not." And I think somewhere along the way I forgot that. I spent so many years being the one who fixed things quietly, who kept the peace, that I forgot sometimes the kindest thing a father can do is just tell his daughter the truth, even when it's ugly, especially when it's ugly. It took months to sort out everything that followed the divorce filing, the untangling of the restaurant's finances, the conversations between lawyers about who owed what to whom. Brett tried calling me twice in that first month, apologetic, asking if we could talk man to man, and both times I told him the same thing, that I would always love the boy he shared with my daughter, and that Tommy would always have a grandfather who showed up for him, but that whatever trust had existed between the two of us had ended on that banquet hall floor, and I was too old to spend what years I had left rebuilding something that had never really been solid to begin with. My hip healed slower than I expected, the way things do at 63 that would have taken a week at 40. The knot on my head faded within a couple of weeks, though I still catch myself touching that spot sometimes without meaning to, an old habit my body picked up that afternoon and never quite let go of. Melissa and Tommy stayed with me for the better part of that first difficult year while she got back on her feet, found a smaller place closer to my house, rebuilt a life that didn't have Brett's name on the lease. I taught Tommy to fish that summer, exactly the way I'd promised, out on the same lake my own father had taken me to 60 years before, and there was something about watching that boy reel in his first sunfish. His whole face lit up with the same wild joy he'd had running across that banquet hall floor, that made me understand something I hadn't fully understood before. You spend a life being the steady one, the quiet one, the man who smooths things over so nobody else has to feel the weight of hard truths, and you start to believe that's just who you are, that patience and silence are the same thing as strength. They're not. I learned that on a cold banquet hall floor at 63 years old, with 120 witnesses and a slideshow of my whole life playing behind me. Real strength isn't staying quiet forever. It's knowing exactly when 41 years of patience has run its course, and standing up anyway, even when your hip aches and your head is ringing and the whole room is staring, because some things are worth more than staying comfortable. Your grandson's safety is worth it. Your daughter's eyes finally opening is worth it. And your own 2 feet, planted firm under you after a lifetime of bending, that's worth more than anything they could ever knock out of you. Tommy still asks me sometimes, when we're out on that lake with our lines in the water, why Grandpa hit Uncle Brett that day. And I tell him what I've come to believe with my whole heart, 63 years and one very long afternoon in the making. I tell him that you should never raise your hand to anyone without good reason, and that anger is a poor compass most days of the week. But I also tell him that when someone knocks you down in front of everyone you love, and you have the strength left in your body to stand back up, you stand up. You look them in the eye, and you let the truth finish what your hands started.